Good afternoon everybody, welcome back into my craft room after what feels like an incredibly long time. Well, what is an incredibly long time? So welcome. If you were looking forward to tuning in last month at the end of June, my apologies. As many of you know, my daughter has been extremely ill recently. She's much better now, thank goodness. But yes, I had to cancel all sorts of things, some of them very short notice, because she was in hospital and then she was back in hospital, and yeah, it was a difficult time, but fingers crossed, all is now well. So I'm now bringing you today in July what I was hoping to bring you at the end of June, which is all about watercolouring for those of us who are paper crafters, and more on that in a minute. The first thing I'm going to do though is just have a quick look at my iPad, make sure that the volume looks okay, because you can never tell until you check. Where are we? Let me just find myself and check that it looks I am live. I'm also just going to check that there's some sound, which hopefully there is. Yes, there is. There's a little delay, which there always is. They are cutting down trees over the road from me, which is not very helpful when I'm wanting to do this with you. But I have shut all the windows, but it's really warm, so I've also had to turn the fan on, but it's quite quiet. I'm hoping that won't bother you. But yes, the chainsaws were not helping concentration today. Right, so a few reminders first of all, as usual, and then we'll get down to the actual watercolouring. So bonus days is still on until the end of July. So July ends on Wednesday the 31st of July. And up until that point, every time you spend £45 on lovely Stampin' Up crafting products, you will be emailed a coupon code which will get £4.50 off any order you place during August. So spend in July and save in August. The order that you use your coupon codes on can be of any size. There's no minimum on that at all. I'm not placing any more group orders this month. However, you will be able to place your own orders on my website, which is sallybowman.stampinup.net. Or I could place them for you to be delivered directly to your home. So if that's something that interests you, just get in touch and let me know. But that runs until Wednesday next week. My next group order will be going in on Friday next week, which is August the 2nd. So get your order to me by 5 p.m. on Friday, and as long as you can collect it from me at home or at a class, then you only pay a contribution towards the shipping of £1.40. So that's a way of saving as well. And finally, the last piece of news I have for you is that my next live is a little bit early. Instead of being on the last Friday of the month, it's going to be on the 23rd of August here on Facebook at 2 p.m. So watch out for that. I will set up an event for it and tell you all about what I'll be doing then. But I think that's everything I needed to say. So we will get on with the watercolouring. Now I have a variety of techniques to show you, which will add a little bit of ta-da to your crafting. I am not a watercolour artist, I will say that straight away and up front. The bonus for that is that you don't need to be a watercolour artist either to enjoy the techniques that I'm going to show you, to bring something extra to what you do. I'm sure many of these techniques will be something that you're familiar with, maybe things that you've done in the past. I know I for one am guilty of often really enjoying doing a particular technique in my crafting, and then my interest is taken by something else and I forget all about what I was originally doing, and it's often not until I see somebody else doing that technique that I remember how much I enjoyed it and how effective it was. So there might be some of those here for you today, which are just reminders. Anyway, we'll get going. I've got a sample sheet to show you, which has got a little sample of every technique I'm going to demonstrate on it. Then I'll go through them one by one and give you some tips and tricks along the way. And then I've got a couple of finished samples to show you at the end where I have used some of the techniques. So I won't be making a completed project for every technique. Today is much more about showing you how to achieve those techniques. So if you are playing along with me, then let me know. I'll go through what I'm going to use each time, and in the meantime I'm just going to turn the camera down to my desktop. I've got my trusty washi tape here to cover over the lens just while I fiddle around with it, and we'll see if I can remember how to do this, how to give you a view of my desktop instead of me. Right, let's have a look. Okay, so first of all, let's reverse the camera so I'm not upside down, and then I will move the camera so it's pointing at my desk. Let's reveal all, and we'll see if that looks anything like close to where I want it to be. I'm sure I will have to do some tweaks. Oh, that's not too bad, is it? Okay, bring that a little bit closer. Do something with this wire here. Okay, I don't think I can bring it down anymore. I will if I can, but I don't think I can, no. I will lift things up to show you though. Okay, let's just see if I can coil this lead up a little bit so it's not so much in your way. Right, so I've got 8 little sample pieces here, and I will show you them more closely. So the first one I'm going to show you is a simple watercolour wash. Try and get that all in. There we are. I've stamped a little frog on this one. I'm actually going to show you with 2 colours. This one I've just done a plain blue background. Then we're going to use a stamped image and colour it in with watercolour pencils. So there's water soluble pencils, and I've used water to dissolve the colour on this one, and I've used a blender pen on this one. Then I'll bring in a spritzer bottle, and I can stamp and spritz or spritz and stamp. So 2 different results using the same tools. Then I'm going to get out my soft pastels, and instead of colouring and then smudging the colour on, I'm actually going to use water to smooth out that colour. And then finally I'm going to stamp, and I'm hoping, can I get this underneath? Yes, you can just about see that. I'm going to stamp and use the ink from that stamped image to watercolour it in, both using a water painter and a blender pen. So there we go, that's a selection of what's in store. Now everything I'm using is in the catalogue, and I have written you out a list here of where you can find it all, but essentially just remember page 118 because everything except for the stamp set I'm using, which is Spotlight on Nature, and the heat tool, which I'm just using to speed up drying if I need to. My room is quite warm, so I may not even need to use it. Everything else is on page 118. We've got the watercolour paper, the water painters, blender pens, watercolour pencils, soft pastels, stamping spritzers, that's the little spray bottles, and the StazOn ink pads, which are waterproof ink pads, plus the refills for the ink pads and the cleaner to get it off your stamps. So that's all on page 118. So that at least is very straightforward and easy. I'll move that out of the way. All right, I've got some kitchen paper here because I'm going to be playing with water. I've got some watercolour paper. Now I'm just using scraps that I've had left over from other projects just so that I can demonstrate the techniques to you. But when you buy the watercolour paper, this is how it comes in pieces which are 5 inches by 7 inches. If I'm doing a card, I usually cut them in half, which gives me a piece which is 3.5 inches by 5. So it's not quite the same as my regular card front size, but it works perfectly well. I just make sure I've got consistent borders around. That way I can get 2 cards from each sheet unless I'm making really large cards. This is a beautiful quality paper. It's thick, and I'm hoping that you can see it's got a slight texture to it. It's smooth enough that you can stamp on, but it has enough texture that it gives you that lovely watercolour look to it. So there's a little bit of texture, so the colour can pool a little bit in the dimples. I haven't found there is any difference to the front and back when I'm using it, really. I think the back is perhaps very slightly more dimply, but it doesn't really make any difference in practice, so I wouldn't get stressed about which side you should be using. So what I'm going to do here is just create a watercolour wash. So very, very simple. We're just going to use water soluble inks and water to spread the colour. So water soluble inks, all our classic stamping pads are water based, so they'll wash off your hands, they'll wash out of your clothes, they'll wash off your tools, and that means that we can add more water to them to get all kinds of effects. And the key thing really when you're doing anything with watercolouring is to understand whether the media you're using are water soluble or not. So the ink pads are water soluble, the ink refills are, and so are the Stampin' Right markers. Now, don't mix these up with the Stampin' Blends markers. Let me show you one of those. Okay, they look completely different. So the Stampin' Right markers does say on them water-based ink, and they have two different tips, the same as the blends, but they have a round barrel. This is a Stampin' Blend, and this says on it alcohol-based ink. So these will not work with the techniques I'm showing you today, and these have a, I was going to say square, I think it's probably rectangular barrel, and they're kind of chunkier than the water-based markers. So water-based markers will work perfectly well for everything I'm doing today using ink pads or re-inkers, so you can use whatever you've got. I've also got a couple of clear blocks here which I'm going to use as my palettes. If you don't have spare clear blocks, then you can use a cellophane bag. You might even have some packaging. If you buy the clear stamps, they come with a clear plastic sheet that they're stuck to inside the box. You can use those, they work really well. You can use a piece of plastic bag. You can use the packaging from your watercolour paper, just something that is not going to let the water and the colour go through. And as I said, I've always got a little bit of paper towel handy because I'm working with water, everything can get very, very wet. All right, so somewhere, what have I done with my piece of watercolour paper? There it is. So I've got watercolour paper and I have a water painter. Now, if you're not familiar with these are paint brushes, and in the barrel is a reservoir for you to fill up with tap water. If you don't have these, of course you can use a paintbrush and a jar of water, but this is not going to get knocked over on your desk, and you're also not going to have to keep changing the water, so I do really like these. They come in a set of 3. This is the wash brush. It's got a very broad, I'm just trying to find something a little bit darker to put it on, there we go, a broad flat brush to it, which is perfect for the technique I'm going to show you. There's also a medium and a fine round brush in the set, so you get all 3 when you buy them. And as I say, I've just filled it up with tap water. So I'm going to use 2 colours. I've got Balmy Blue and Lemon Lime Twist here. Now I'm going to use the re-inkers. Hopefully you've got a re-inker to match every one of your ink pads, because otherwise when your ink pads start running out, you're not going to be able to refill them. And never throw away your ink pads. Get a bottle of re-inker and just re-ink them, and they'll go on for years and years and years. But these are also brilliant for all kinds of watercolour techniques. Now, if you haven't got the re-inkers, an alternative is to, and I need to get another another ink pad, hang on. I said ink pad, of course I meant clear block. If you haven't got re-inkers, use an ink pad, take a clear block and just press it in, and hopefully you can see that has just picked up some of the ink, and I can use that in exactly the same way. Or as another alternative, the water-based markers, use the brush end and just scribble it on a block, and that too will lay down ink which you can pick up with your brush. So let me grab just another scrap of paper. So I'll put those aside in a second because they're the ones I'm going to actually use, but let me just show you. So this is the ink I picked up from the ink pad, and there we go, it paints on beautifully. And let's just get the ink pad ink off so that I can give you a true test. So I'm squeezing the barrel, that squeezes some water through the bristles, and I can catch it on this. You can see the colours come off, and that's now clean. So this is the ink from the Stampin' Right marker. Just pick that up with the wet brush. Need a little bit more water. There we go. And that brushes on just fine as well. You need a little bit more work with the markers because they don't lay down as much ink each time as pressing your block onto the ink pad will, or indeed as the re-inker does. But you can definitely do it with those. All right, so to go back to where I was, which is I've got my 2 clear blocks here. I'm going to pop my watercolor paper down on here. First thing I'm going to do is to just squeeze this and drop a little bit of water into my ink. These re-inkers are quite concentrated, and so I definitely want to dilute them down. Have a piece of scrap paper and then you can test your colour and see how dark it is. The next thing I'm going to do is just wet this paper. So again, I am just squeezing the barrel of my water painter and spreading the water all over my watercolour paper. Don't try and do this on ordinary card, basic white. We're using much too much water, it won't work. But I've just got that wet all over. It's drying really quickly in this room actually, but hopefully if I work fast we'll be fine. So now I'm just mixing the water with the re-inker, and I'm just going to work fairly quickly to and fro on here and get some of that lovely balmy blue down. Okay, and it goes on really nice and smoothly because the paper's wet, so the ink just blends. And because it's a water soluble ink, if I want to, I can get it wet again and spread the ink again, and most of the ink has not absorbed into the paper. Most of it will be moving again with no trouble at all. So now I'm going to add some of that lemon lime twist, and I'm going to come up and over where the blue finishes. I'm going to just squeeze a little bit more water on there and just help me blend those two together. There we are. And then I've got a beautiful ink washed background as quickly as anything. So that's really, really easy. Now, of course, I can use that as a background, but what you can also do once it's dry is that you can die cut from it. You can punch from it. It's quite tough paper, so be careful. Die cutting works better. Very, very easy, very straightforward. And I'm just cleaning my brush on here. So for instance, you can make a piece of watercolor paper with flower colors on it and then die cut flowers from it, and because of the variations you get in the color when you're watercoloring, you will get flowers with variations. No two will be the same. So that is drying really quickly, but if I want to speed it up, I can just dry it off carefully with my heat tool. So there we go, that's number one. That's with a watercolor wash. So number two, I'm going to get a few more bits out. I'm going to do some stamping. These are the stamps I'm using, Spotlight on Nature. You obviously want, if you're going to colour in, you obviously want an open image that's got some space in it for colouring. Then I've got some watercolour pencils here. And I have a permanent ink pad, which I'll talk about in just a minute. So watercolour pencils, there are two different sets in the catalogue, set 1 and set 2. Set 1 has a few more colours in it, there are 13 colours in that, and set 2 has 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 colours. They all work in exactly the same way. Get yourself a decent metal pencil sharpener, and then they sharpen just like pencils. And they colour just like ordinary colouring pencils. You don't have to use water with the colour at all. You can just use them as ordinary colours. And they're all coordinated with our colours in the collection, so everything will match beautifully for you. So that's my Spotlight on Nature set. I'm going to use the little butterfly for this. So once again, I've got some watercolour paper. Now you can use ordinary basic white card for this if you really have to. I recommend watercolour paper because then you don't have to worry about the surface of the paper degrading. The thing about ordinary card is that once you start applying water using a water painter, then the surface gets wet and then it will start to come off or go into little pills. Sometimes call it pilling. And you've really spoiled your project then. The blender pens are less likely to cause problems because they don't get so wet as a wet brush can. But if you can use watercolour paper, you'll get a much better effect. So I've got my Stays On ink pad here. This one is saddle brown. We've also got a black one in the catalogue. Now these are solvent ink pads. These are permanent. If you get them on your clothes, they're not going to wash out. And if you mix them with water, the ink is not going to move. So if I was to stamp my image in one of our classic ink pads, whatever the colour, when I add lots of water to it, that ink, because it's a water-based ink, is going to move across the page. It's not going to stay in a nice crisp outline. And usually I don't want that, although as you'll see in a minute, I will be exploiting that fact for one of the techniques. But if I want my outline to stay crisp, which I do for this, then you need a permanent ink pad, so Stays On. And I'm using brown just because it's not quite such a harsh colour as the black. So I'm just going to stamp as I normally would. And there's my little butterfly. This ink is dry almost straight away. To get it off the stamp, you are going to need Stays On cleaner. Because this is solvent based, using our normal stamp cleaners or a chamois which is dampened with water isn't going to make that ink move. Now some crafters don't worry about the ink being on there, they just leave it on there, and they know that it's not going to transfer when they use ordinary ink pads, because we know already that the water in these doesn't move this permanent ink. I always clean mine just because I like my stamps to be clean, so I've got Stays On cleaner. I just dab the cleaner on there, dab off the cleaner with some kitchen paper until the stamp is clean, and then I clean it as normal on my stamping scrub. We have re-inkers for these ink pads in the catalogue as well. Right, so that's permanent ink pads. That's how to clean your stamps. Oh, and don't use Stays On ink on photopolymer stamps, the clear stamps, because this the ink, but particularly the cleaner, will eat away at the stamps and they'll go sticky and then they'll disintegrate. So it's for red rubber stamps only. All right, so here's my little butterfly, and let's colour it in. So just pick some of my favourite butterfly colours. And when I come to activate this pencil, I'm going to use a water painter on some of it, and I'm going to use a blender pen on some of it. So I will do the top wings with one and the bottom wings with another. So I'm being quite quick about this because this isn't a colouring in demonstration. And you don't have to be super exact. If you're going to be activating the colour, if I lift this up to you, I haven't coloured all the way to the edges. I haven't worried too much about the colour being applied really evenly across the different areas, because the water painter or the blender pen is going to do that for me. Let's just put those out of the way. There we are. Okay, so I've got the fine tipped water painter here. You saw me use the broad tipped or wash brush earlier. This one has got a much finer tip on it. And I'm also going to be using a blender pen. So these come in packs of 3. They last for absolutely ages. They've got 2 tips which are identical. There's no difference in those. And they've got some kind of magical fluid in the barrel which blends with water-based media and allows you to do various techniques with them. So this feels a bit more like a felt pen. If you aren't very comfortable colouring using a paintbrush, which certainly is not as forgiving perhaps as a felt pen, you can't be as precise with it, then maybe a blender pen will be for you. So let me start off. I'm going to start at the top of my butterfly with my water painter, and I'm going to do the orange areas first and then clean the tip of my brush and then do the pink ones. And all I'm doing, I don't know if I can do it in the air, but I'll try, is just going over that pencil, and the colour is turning into paint really and spreading itself across my image. So I've just squeezed the barrel to squeeze some water through the bristles and to activate, to clean it off, and then I can come back and activate some more. So I'll try and show you on this pink area. I'm not very good at painting in the air. There we go. So I'm just smoothing out that colour. So I'll tidy it up down on my desk and then I'll lift it up again to show you. There we are. So this now looks much more like watercolour paint than pencil, and if you look on the lower wing here you can see what the pencil looked like. So I'm now going to swap over to my blender pen and colour in this bottom wing here. So again I'm going to do one colour at a time and clean the tip of my pen in between. I can be much more accurate with this. It's got quite a fine point on it, although it's sort of like a brush pen. And so I've just done the pink area there. And then to clean my pen, I'm just going to scribble on some scrap paper. Until the colour comes off, and then now it's scribbling clear. So all the pink is off that, and I can now go on to the orange. Now you can use 2 colours of watercolour pencil in one area, so you could mix a bit like I did on the watercolour wash. You could have a blue and a green and blend them together to make variations in colour. So there are a lot of fun watercolour pencils. So the top of the butterfly's wing I activated with water. The bottom I've activated with a blender pen. This bit in the middle is just the pencil as it was laid straight down. So don't know how clearly you can see the difference. There is not very much difference at all. I think the blender pen gives you a slightly more even effect, but it's less like watercolour. So depending on what you want, you can pick and choose between those. So next, okay, I had some had some watercolour paper for that. Can't find it. Okay, let's just get a couple more scraps out. I'm sure I cut some nice neat pieces. That's okay. Let's find a couple here that are similar sizes. Alright, so we're going to do stamp and spritz, or spritz and stamp. So I've got another image here from the Spotlight on Nature set, which is this one here. I've got Mossy Meadow ink, so we've already talked about the fact that this is a water-based ink, so that means that it will move when it gets wet. Ooh, sorry, that's my wire just come adrift. Let's get rid of that. So I'm going to ink my stamp in the usual way, and then I'm going to moisten it. So this is a stamping spritzer. It's just a very fine mist bottle. I've just filled it up with water from the tap, and I'm going to spritz the stamp just a couple of times. Okay, so the water is kind of diluting the ink a little bit on the stamp. I'm going to do just a tiny bit more. Ooh. That's better. Okay, now how much water? Frankly, that's trial and error. So let's just see. So I usually do a little couple of test pieces. Each stamp reacts a little bit differently because each stamp holds different amounts of ink. So basically I've just got very wet ink on this stamp. So if I hold that up and show you, that looks a lot more like it's been painted on than it's been stamped on. If I dry that off and then stamp just regularly, you'll be able to see the difference. So this is just basic white card here. So I've re-inked my stamp, no spritzing. Oops, re-inked that too quickly. You can see I missed a bit at the top, but it won't matter. Okay, so if I put those two side by side, you can see this is a much crisper impression. This one has got more blurring of the ink and the details on it. So that's stamping, and then you can do it the other way by spritzing the paper first and then stamping. So the first time round I spritzed my stamp. Now I'm definitely going to put this on some paper first. I'm going to re-ink the stamp in the usual way. I'm going to spritz my paper, my watercolour paper, so that is wet. And then I'm going to stamp on top. And almost instantly everything blurs. Can you see the difference that makes? So that gives me, let's just tip off some of that water, a really kind of impressionistic background. If I do another one with less water, then you'll get a kind of an in-between effect. If I don't put paper down, I will find that my desk is just awash and everything I do afterwards will get soggy. Okay, so let's re-ink the stamp ready. Then I'm going to spritz my watercolour paper again, but a lot less. So I got it really wet before. So that's a little bit of water, but it's not wet all over. So now the ink is moving, but not nearly as much. And actually, if I want to, I can increase the movement on that just by spritzing again. So I'm going to go from higher up just to kind of allow the spray of water to go over a wider area with smaller droplets. Can you see? Hold it up. Can I hold it up and do it? You can just keep going as much as you want. And of course, if you like, you know, droplets, you can hold it up and let everything move. And I'm just going to dry this one off, which doesn't even look like a leaf anymore, and then show you what you can do if you go for a really wet one like this. I'm holding this in a peg so I don't burn my hands. This will be a little bit noisy. hopefully you can hear me over the heat tool. If you heat both sides of it, then it helps it to go flat. Right, let's just see if that's dry. I think it's dry. It feels kind of crispy again now. All right, so I've got that vaguely leaf-shaped background. What I really like doing is then coming back with exactly the same stamp, the same ink, and stamping on top. Now I can only roughly see where that leaf was, but I'm going to stamp back on top. So I've added back the detail. I've got some lovely kind of greenery effects in the background, and that's something I really like to do. I think that's a lot of fun, very effective. So let's put that out of the way, and the next thing we're going to do is bring in some soft pastels, and I must just drink some water, excuse me. Okay, so this is the last technique I'm going to show you, and then I'll show you some samples and do a kind of a quick summary of where we are. All right, so again I've got watercolour paper here because I don't have to worry about how much water I use on it. You can use basic white card for this, as long as you don't get it too wet with your brush. However, I really like the texture. This card, the watercolour paper, has got much more tooth to it than the ordinary basic white card, because that basic white is designed for stamping on. It's got a super smooth surface, whereas pastels actually work better if you've got something with a little bit of tooth to it, a little bit of roughness for the pastel to grip. So this time I'm going to use this flower image. I don't know if it's a tulip, I think of it as a tulip anyway, from Spotlight on Nature. I'm going to use Stays On ink again because I'm about to add water, but this time I'm using the black. These Stays On ink pads are felt, they're made of felt, so you do need a firmer hand when you're inking. Okay, so again I've got a red rubber stamp which isn't going to be hurt by this solvent based ink. So that's my flower, and I've also got a piece of scrap card here. Now this card also has, I don't know if you can see, a little bit of tooth to it. This is actually the packaging from the watercolour paper, which has got this rather nice texture on the back, and I'm going to use this as my palette. I'm also going to use the one of the water painters. I'm just searching through my bits and pieces here. There we go. This is the medium sized one, so you've seen all three of them now. This one's a little bit stained with green, but it is clean. So it's a round brush, but it's got a medium sized tip. So let's just prepare our palette. So let's have some purple for the flower. So I'm just going to scribble the pastel onto this. I'm hoping you can see I've actually got some powder kind of sitting on the top there. These are soft pastels, they're chalky, and so they kind of scribble off a bit as if you were scribbling chalk. And there's some green. Now again, you can mix these colours together if you want. You don't have to use them just as they come, and just those how many are there? 6, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 8, just those 8 colours. So I'm just going to squeeze my brush, make sure I've got water running through the bristles, pick up some of the pastel, and then paint with it. And the more I keep painting, the more water mixes in with the pastel and the paler the colours get. I'll just quickly finish this flower and then I'll lift it up and show you. And it dries very matte, but it doesn't really look like pastels. It's quite interesting. Alright, so that's my flower. Haven't checked to see if there's any comments. I don't think there are any comments. I can't see any, at least. Okay, let's add a little bit of green, and then I'm going to come back and just add some detail to that flower. I just squeezed my brush and got a little bit more water out just to mix with this. I've almost made a paint just so it's fluid enough for me to draw down that fine stem there. There we are. So that's a couple of leaves. I don't need to do all of it to show you. Okay, and then I'm going to come back to my purple and pick up a little bit more of that pastel and just go over the lines that are in the stamped image here. There are some sort of sketchy lines, and if I go over those with my brush and with more of the pastel powder, I've got a much deeper purple that I'm applying. Again, I'm just going to get a little bit of water out. My brush was getting a bit dry. There we are. So I'm just following the artwork from the stamped image. There we are. Hopefully you can see I've just added some more detail to that flower. And of course you can combine all these techniques. So for instance, I could make a background, make sure that's dry, stamp my image on it, stamp my flower on it, colour my flower in, and then I've got the watercolour wash background, and then I've got the pastel flower on top. Or I could have coloured it with my watercolour pencils. I could have done some of these smudgy leaves in the background and then stamped my flower on top and coloured it in a little more precisely to bring it into the foreground. You can just go on forever with these. So there we are, watercolouring with pastels, which may not be something you've thought of. Let me bring back the sampler sheet. So we did the watercolour wash. Here I did it with 2 colours. Then we did the stamped image coloured in with watercolour pencils, and I used both a water painter and a blending brush on it, blender pen, sorry. Then we did inking the stamp and spritzing it, and then we did spritzing the paper and stamping on it. We did the soft pastels and water. I actually did these, there we go. And then we've got one more. Let me find, I've got some paper set aside for that. Here we are. So for these, I'm going to stamp as normal. So I'm back to my old olive ink pad. I'm back to my leaf stamp for the last 2. So I'm going to do them one at a time. So let's use the water painter. So I've just stamped that, and I said this was a water soluble ink. All I'm doing is colouring in this leaf with a wet brush, and what happens is that the ink, which is water soluble, immediately starts to mix with the water on the brush, and you can then spread that ink around and colour in your image. Now if I'd stamped this and then was trying to do this tomorrow or even in an hour or so, it probably wouldn't work. The different inks all work slightly differently, but in general you want to stamp this and then immediately do this, because once this ink has really dried, it doesn't want to move nearly as readily. It will move, but your colours will be much paler. There we go. So we're really exploiting the fact that this is a water-based ink. There we are. So I've retained some of the detail on that stamped leaf, but I've also spread some of the ink out. And while that's wet, that ink will continue to move a little bit. So if you get it to the point where you really like it, then dry it with your heat tool and stop that, the wateriness, if you like, spreading and increasing. Then I can do the same but use a blender pen, and because I want a freshly stamped image, I didn't stamp both of these at once, because I might have found when I got to this second one that the ink had dried sufficiently that it didn't move very much at all. So stamped it again, bring in my blender pen, and like magic the colour is coming out of the stamped image detail and turning into watercolour paint. Or watery ink anyway. It's not really paint, but that's probably more technical than I can manage to explain. Okay, so that is my last two techniques, which I nearly forgot, so I'm glad I was going through the summary sheet. There we are, that's these two at the bottom. If I put those two side by side for you to look at, there's not very much difference. You get, I think, slightly less even colour when you use a water painter as compared with when you use a blender pen. Alright, so that's all those techniques. Let me show you a couple of finished projects. So on this one I used the very first technique I showed you, which was the watercolour wash, done using the really broad paintbrush and some re-inkers. So this time I've created a much bigger piece. I used Daffodil Delight, Peach Pie and Pretty in Pink, and just blended them together for a kind of a sunrise effect. I've then stamped on the top and I'm gone completely blank as to what that stamp set is called. Feathered Flight. Sorry, I'm just looking at my shelf. Feathered Flight, the two ducks. I added some designer series paper in Pretty in Pink, and the black layer has been embossed. I don't know if that's showing with the So Swirly embossing folder. Very difficult to show it on the camera when it's black, but it just provides some nice texture to it. And then I added a couple of little pieces of gingham ribbon here and some rhinestones, which I coloured using my basic black Stamping Blends marker. So instead of being silvery rhinestones, they're black. Let's just drink some more water. It's very dry in this room. I've also been talking. And then here is another one. So this is the one where I spritzed the watercolour paper and then I stamped on top of it. So I've used this same stamp that I was using just now, but to ink the stamp I used Stamping Right markers. That's the water-based markers. I used Berry Burst and Granny Apple Green. And I used these instead of ink pads just so that I could have pink flowers and green stems. Obviously it's all one stamp, so that's much harder to do using ink pads. It's much easier with markers, but because the markers are water-based, then when I stamped on the wet watercolour paper. Of course, the ink ran. So dried off the watercolour paper with my heat tool, then I re-inked my stamp and stamped on top again, a bit like I showed you with the leaf. So I've now got the detail of the flowers, but I've also got the smudginess in all the right places underneath. This is one of the little die cut butterflies. So I used my blending brush to blend ink over it to turn it from a white butterfly into a pink one. And then I used, I'm trying to think what I've done with my stamps. Let me just grab my stamps. They were on the floor, I couldn't reach with my microphone on. I used this crosshatch image here to stamp on the butterfly. And then I diluted some of the ink. I pressed my clear block into the ink pads, diluted some of that ink, both the green and the pink, with water, picked it up on one of my water painter brushes and just spattered. Then again, I've added rhinestones, a little bit of embossed card behind there, and it's a card with a cutaway front. So again, I've used watercolour paper for both of these, because both the techniques used a lot of water, and I really like them. I'm pleased with those cards. So I'm just having a look. I can't see. Ah, there's Mary. Hello, Mary. Made it. You're a bit late, but you're watching now. Lovely. Okay, great. I can't see there are any questions from anybody. So what I'm going to do now is cover myself up again, bring the camera back up so you can see my face and say my goodbyes to you. So let's just cover that up there. Where are we? Let's reverse the camera, hopefully. Yes, hooray, and there we are. So I hope you enjoyed that little foray into watercolouring. As I say, I am no watercolour artist. Mary, who's watching, actually is a watercolour artist. She does the most beautiful watercoloured pictures. I'm not, but I do enjoy using those techniques in my paper crafting. I hope I've given you a few ideas. I'm using things that you mostly already have. I'm hopeful anyway, and that you will send me some photos if you have a go. I always love to see what you make. Thank you so much for joining me today. I hope you have a lovely weekend, whatever you're doing. I think the weather is supposed to be reasonable. I'm not promising you blue skies and endless sunshine, but with any luck we won't get any more rain for at least a couple of days. So I will be back with you on, what did I say, 23rd, I think it was, of August. Yes, 23rd of August. And yes, I'll let you know what I'm doing. I will put an event up on my Facebook page, so watch out for that. In the meantime, thanks so much for joining me. Have a good weekend, and bye-bye.